collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
This week, what should the government do about the increasing cost of electricity?
Remove all VAT on the cost of emission allowances, because amazingly, even though emission allowances can be seen as a tax, the government is applying VAT to that. Tax on a tax.
And is a cap on fuel prices a realistic solution to the rising cost of living?
In the long run, we know what we can do. We can do things like build a public transport system and buy more fuel-efficient cars and so forth and so forth. But in the short run, what can you do? That's the problem here. There's not really much you can do in the short run. You have to go to work. You have to take the kids to school.
A special meeting is being held today at the Presidential Palace in Nicosia, which aims to tackle high electricity prices. I don't think anyone needs reminding, they just have to go to the shops, that everything is going up in price. And a lot of that is fuelled by the fact that electricity is going up because of the raw materials used to create it. Well, is there anything that the government can do? They're going to be meeting with SERA, the Cyprus Energy Regulatory Authority, and the Electricity Authority of Cyprus. Energy expert Charles Elinas joins us now. Charles, there are different ways to come at this, I think, but putting a price cap on electricity isn't going to work because there are other things at play here, aren't there?
That's true. If the government puts a price cap, it cannot control the price of imported diesel and mazout used to produce electricity. As a result, that means that the government needs to subsidize the price cap. So it's not possible. There are other ways of doing it. But, first, let me say that what we're seeing now, in a way, is the tip of the iceberg, because prices are expected to go further up later in the year, probably next year. So the cost of electricity has one way to go, up, more than now. So any measures the government wants to implement now must bear that in mind, that they cannot just be a temporary solution. They need to take into account the longevity of this price increase. And the main reason for it is that the global energy crisis, of course, and the tight supply of oil in the world. There is not enough oil in the world. In fact, actually, I was just reading an article that OPEC is unable to produce the oil it pledged to produce by about 500,000 barrels of oil a day. And the reason is because there is not enough oil. In addition to that, the sanctions by the US and Europe on Russian oil and oil products have made the availability of diesel and mazout more difficult. There are shortages in the global markets. As a result, you can imagine that such shortages produce higher prices. Hence, we are at the receiving end of these in Cyprus, since our electricity production depends greatly on burning diesel and mazout.
Right, but let's talk, shall we, about RES and renewable energy, because we do have wind farms and solar parks here in Cyprus, but my understanding is that the rate that is paid to the producers of that renewable energy is way above what the Electricity Authority can sell it at. Is that right?
That's right. Unfortunately, the contracts that were awarded for construction of RES facilities over 2 or 3 years ago were such that they were not competitive. They were, in effect, handed out. And EAC was forced to pay a price to these people of the order of 18 to 19 cents per kilowatt hour, while their costs were probably below 6 cents an hour. I read that recently SERA has put a limit to this to 11 cents per kilowatt hour, but this is still very high. I mean, this is almost 100% profit. In the rest of the world, the profit of such facilities is below 20%, let alone 100%.
So basically, why on earth did we sign contracts guaranteeing such a high price for people who came into the renewable energy sector if we knew that it was going to be totally unviable for the EAC and they have, I suppose, to pass on to the consumers the loss?
Well, that's exactly what is happening. That's why you are seeing no benefit as far as the electricity price is concerned from the adoption of renewables. Why did they do it? I have no idea. It should have been competitive bidding. Everything should be done through competitive bidding, and the projects should be open to everybody, including the EAC. We need to build as much renewables as possible. But, let's go back to your question about this electricity price, and let me give you some background to see what can be done. So if we look at the Eurostat statistics for last year, which are available now, during the second half of last year, the average price of electricity for Cyprus households was 23 cents per kilowatt hour. Out of that, 37% was due to taxes. In Greece, the comparative numbers were 19.5 cents per kilowatt hour and only 20% taxes. And in Malta, a small country like us, the price was 13 cents and the tax was only 5%. Why on earth are we charging such a high price and such high taxes when even Greece or Malta charge a lot less? That also shows that there is room to do something about it. So these taxes can be reduced substantially. And there is something else that is happening. The government with the EAC is charged the cost of emissions through the European emissions trading system. Well, this year, the government is going to collect close to 250 million euros out of the taxpayer as a result of this, because the money collected comes back to Cyprus, to the Cyprus government. Sadly, all of that money is used for the national budget instead of actually being used to improve the adoption of renewables and assist vulnerable households. So I can give you some ideas as to what can be done. I mean, there is something else as well that is telling about the benefit of all of these things to the government. So at the end of last year, when the state budget was approved, the state budget had a 1.3% deficit accepted. By May this year, the government was actually making a 1% surplus. So that implies an improvement, an annual improvement of 2.3% on the budget, which is about 575 million euros. So where is this coming from? And it's very obvious that all this money that the government is collecting, out of which it benefits, comes from these taxes on energy, and this money it collects from the emissions trading system. That's where this benefit is coming from. And it's a windfall, basically, a windfall that the government didn't budget for, didn't plan for, and it's not reasonable to expect that to be plowed back into helping people cope with this incredible problem they're facing. And this is where I'm coming from. We have that money, the money that the government has been collecting out of these taxes, and for which it hasn't budgeted. And as a result, if it was happy or content with a budget with 1.3% deficit, that means it can use that unplanned windfall of 575 million to help people. So I'm suggesting a number of things based on what Greece is doing and what Malta is doing. First of all, reduce VAT on electricity to 5%. Second, remove all VAT on the cost of emission allowances, because amazingly, even though emission allowances can be seen as a tax, the government is applying VAT to that, tax on a tax. And then produce a substantial reduction on other taxes on electricity. Malta is applying almost zero tax. Greece is applying a small tax. We should do the same, reduce the tax on electricity to small amounts. And a fourth point is that we should use 50% of these revenues from the emissions trading system to assist vulnerable households to cope with the high cost of energy. And then the remainder should be used to upgrade the electrical grid and advance the adoption of RES and battery storage. So these are the measures that can be implemented, and nobody can come back and say, yeah, but where are we going to find the money? The money will come exactly from where, as I said, from this windfall the government has in its hands as a result of collecting taxes, increased taxes from energy, from the increased cost of energy.
Well, it did say, I think, in the paper that at that meeting today that they were going to discuss to make better use of the greenhouse gas emission allowances. But I also read somewhere that the President had told, I think it was the CYBC, that he was also mulling taxing the company's profits, the RES company's profits. Surely they pay tax, don't they?
Of course, that's what other countries have done. So that should be done anyway, because these are exorbitant profits. If these companies, if the cost of producing their electricity is down to 5 or 6 cents, and they are charging EC close to 19 cents, then there is every right for the government to go and apply taxes on these and recover as much as possible and put it back into assisting those who are paying for it. But it's not going to be a great deal of money, because the amount of renewables being used in electricity in Cyprus is relatively low. Nevertheless, it should be done. But what I'm strongly suggesting, though, Rosie, is that these measures to cut down the cost of energy, of electricity, to invest in renewables and the grid so that we can accept more renewables, is there, is available. The government has been collecting this money from people through these very high prices of electricity and energy. And it can only increase later in the year. So it should be plowed back to assist in the implementation of renewables and turn things around.
So there is a possibility that they can turn round. Charles, while I've got you here, I want to also ask you about the East Med pipeline, because the Foreign Minister, Ioannis Kassoulidis, don't laugh, the Foreign Minister, Ioannis Kassoulidis, said earlier this week that there was little interest, or no interest it seems, and he thought it was worrying, in that East Med pipeline. So what is going on there?
Well, there never was interest in the East Med gas pipeline other than by politicians. The companies that are supposed to benefit from the pipeline and are expected to invest and put in the know-how to build it are not interested. So far they haven't expressed an interest at all throughout all these years of talking about it. And the reason is very simple. Europe has made it very clear. Its targets are to get rid of Russian gas during this decade, and it needs more gas and more LNG from others so that it can stop using Russian gas. But only during this decade. The European Union has also made it very clear that its aim is to transit as rapidly as possible to renewables and get rid of fossil fuels as fast as possible. Then it has a target to reduce the use of gas in Europe by 30% by 2030 and continuously from there to zero by 2050. Within those targets, there is no room for new imports, new major gas pipelines that need 20 plus years of life to produce results. So if the European target is 2030, this pipeline will need 5 to 7 years to be built and then it needs to operate for another 20 plus years to produce results. In other words, it should be guaranteed to be able to operate until about 2050 if it's going to be viable. Well, it cannot happen because Europe has a clear target that long before that it will get rid of gas. So there is no future in the pipeline, and that's why those who are expected to invest do not invest, because why would you invest billions of euros to build a pipeline, the life of which is going to be limited, and you're not going to recover your investment? So it's a project that has been supported by politicians, and I'm glad to see Mr. Kassoulidis seeing the light and going behind others who have already said that it's not viable. I have been saying that for a long time, and move on and go and do other things that can benefit the island, like what we were discussing earlier on: invest in renewables, invest in modernizing the grid, invest in batteries, and move away from fossil fuels into clean energy, bring the cost down, but also make pollution less, produce less pollution by going to renewables.
Kassoulidis told MPs that the government is looking at alternative solutions, such as transporting Cyprus natural gas, which of course we haven't got to yet, by tanker to installations in Egypt.
I don't know what you mean by tanker, because if it's going to go to Egypt, there is only one way to go, by pipeline. By tanker, it means that it will come here first, it will be liquefied and go to Egypt as liquefied natural gas, which is not the way to do it. It's by pipeline. But you can come back to the same problem again, in that if Europe is saying that the life for gas is 10 years, it makes it difficult for such a project. But also elsewhere, Kassoulidis accepted that we cannot develop gas from Cyprus EZ while the Cyprus problem remains unresolved and Turkish threats continue. The investors again, the companies and the banks, hesitate to invest in projects which are subject to very strong geopolitical risk. And that risk is continuously there. Turkey is threatening to intervene if we do anything about the gas in Cyprus EZ. That dissuades investors from investing in projects.
Right, now then, again on Tuesday at this meeting at Parliament, the press reported that the Foreign Minister briefed Parliament on the electricity link between Cyprus and Crete. Work apparently is expected to start in 2024, but apparently there are problems there too, because the company assigned the project says it now wants to reroute the subsea cable so that it doesn't come into proximity with Turkish areas.
Well, I don't know where this has come from, simply because if one admits that there are Turkish areas, as you know, Turkey has agreed a delineation of its own EZ with Libya, and it draws a line that connects the EZ of Turkey with the EZ of Libya. That means that the cable, one way or another, has to pass through those areas. So how can they avoid the Turkish areas or the Libyan areas? It's not possible. So I'm not so sure about that. I think my own understanding is that the company is trying to negotiate the additional funding required to proceed with the project. It has received the money from the European Union, plus the 100 million euros from the Reconstruction and Resilience Fund, and it needs more to reach the 1.5 billion euros required to build the project. And I understand that there are negotiations with banks like the EIB and EBRD to secure that money. And I also understand that the deadline now for the operation is the beginning of 2026. I believe the project is they're still pushing for it, but they require to secure the additional funding.
Is the electricity coming to Cyprus from Crete, or are we planning to sell ours there?
Well, it can go either way. That's the purpose of the interconnector. The interconnector facilitates the transfer of surplus electricity from one country to the other as and when it happens. So if we have surplus electricity, it can go to Crete and vice versa. And obviously from Crete, with Crete being connected to Attica and from there to Europe, this interconnection will connect Cyprus to Europe. So it can be either way. That's the usefulness of interconnectors. And they provide also, because of this flexibility to transport electricity either way, it makes it easier to also increase the adoption of renewables. And I'm coming back to that because it's critical for us. The European Union is about to increase the target for renewables for 2030 for electricity production. The number that is being discussed now is 69% of electricity production should come from renewables by 2030.
We're nowhere near that.
We're way behind that. And if we're going to achieve that, we need to do a number of things. We need to, first of all, improve or modernize our grid, which is antiquated and cannot accept all these renewables, so it's not flexible enough. We need to introduce battery storage to give us more flexibility, and we need the interconnector. If we do all of these things, then it opens the way to increase the adoption of renewables in electricity production to more than 50% by 2030, and that is what we should be aiming for.
It does look as if we've got an awful lot of work to do as soon as possible. Charles, we have to leave it there. Thank you.
That's exactly it. We need to do it as soon as possible.
Thank you very much once again for putting us in the picture on our energy problems, which just seem to be growing up and up and up. It's rather worrying. Charles Elinas, our energy expert here on the Cyprus News Digest, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Rosie.
And it's not just the rising price of electricity which is hitting hard at the moment. Last week in Parliament, the discussion revolved around whether or not there should be a cap on fuel prices in Cyprus, because as anyone who has a car or a motorbike knows, the price of fuel is going up exponentially and it's expected to reach €2 a litre by mid-July. Well, is a price cap a good idea? I'm not even sure it's legal at the moment, but I know, as you know if you're a regular listener, very little about economics, which is why I've invited my next guest to join me to discuss the issue. He is Professor Sofronis Kleridis, Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Management at the University of Cyprus. Sofronis, my first thought, and as I did just say, I'm not an economist by any manner of means, was if I'm importing fuel and the government tells me the maximum I'm allowed to charge for it, with prices of wholesale fuel going up the way they are, I might just stop importing it because I'd make a loss.
Well, that would be a wise business decision. Nobody wants to be selling at a loss, right? So that's one issue with price caps, especially in a volatile market such as fuel, where prices go up and down on a daily basis. That's what makes it complicated to have a price cap on a market like this.
So what is the answer? I mean, do you know whether it is legal? I read something that said at the moment it's not, but even the finance minister seemed to be in favour of the possibility of capping the price.
Well, I think, there's a law that was voted a few years ago that gives the Minister of Commerce the right to impose a price cap under some circumstances. And now the proposal which is being discussed right now is basically to broaden that mandate, so to make it a bit easier for the minister to impose a price cap. And I think the minister is supporting it in the sense that it's not imposing a price cap, it just gives the Minister of Commerce the ability to impose a price cap if he or she thinks that it's appropriate. So it's just giving an extra tool, which, may or may not be useful, but, it's there.
Would it not make more sense? I mean, we can't prevent a lot of these price rises happening. They're happening all over the world. But wouldn't it make more sense to look at what the profit margin was on things like fuel?
It would, and that's what some of the proposals are. I mean, this market is one of the most closely watched markets. I mean, I cannot think of another product or service that is being so closely watched. Everybody is extremely sensitive about the price of fuel. The energy service, I think it's called, in the Ministry of Commerce, is tracking these prices. The competition service is also looking at these prices. We're actually spending quite a lot of resources keeping track of these prices and trying to make sure that they keep close to the cost, And according to what they say, these government agencies say, there's a profit margin of about 15 cents per liter, which is the total profit that the company, the importer company, the big company, plus the gas station owners make. So for every liter, the company plus the owner make about 15 cents, and that's the split between them. That's not entirely fixed, but I would say probably from what I hear, it's about 2/3 to the company, 1/3 to the gas station owner. That's sort of roughly the profit, what the profit margins are.
Which is not it's not a huge margin, is it? Really, let's face it. The problem I think here is that since so many people and so many businesses rely on the price of fuel being fairly standard because that's how they cost what they sell and what they deliver, it's going to have a knock-on effect regardless, isn't it, on pretty well everything?
Well, that's true, and we don't have many alternatives. We don't have much. Our public transport system is not great, so you don't really have that many alternatives. And so we're forced to pay these high prices. In the long run, we know what we can do. We can do things like build a public transport system and buy more fuel-efficient cars and so forth and so forth. But in the short run, what can you do with this? And that's the problem here. There's not really much you can do in the short run. You have to go to work. You have to take the kids to school. We can try and limit our trips, or maybe carpool a little bit, but that's not, it's not going to make a huge difference, right? So we're kind of stuck, and that's the problem basically with this market. And of course, there are the people who take the option of going to the north and filling their tanks from there.
What if you look at the whole picture economically at the moment, because it's not just fuel, is it? We've got a huge rise in the increase of grain, of animal feed. All of that's going to end up making things on the supermarket shelves more expensive. And yet, if we have inflation, we've got to be very careful, have we not, that we don't end up doing things that are either going to put us into stagflation or, well, I don't know. What's the answer?
Well, the answer is that there's no easy answer. I'm afraid it's a very, very difficult situation that we were facing. We had the pandemic. We got out of the pandemic. We're trying to get out of the pandemic. We're not even really out yet. And we had this bout of inflation, which is due to a combination of, supply factors, transportation problems, shortages, and so forth. Plus, also, it's a bit of extra demand that people are now, finally, they have a chance to spend after they've been stuck inside for 2 years. So, this combination of increased demand and supply that's unable to respond to this demand is raising prices. And then the war comes on top of it. If that was not enough, we had the war, which made things a lot worse, especially when it comes to energy, minerals, grain, and other very basic things, right? So it's a very tough situation, and I wish I had an easy answer for you, but I don't. I have one little piece of good news, by the way, just because just before we hooked up on the phone, I looked at the current prices of oil, and they've gone down a bit the last couple of weeks, which basically means that the changes in the international price of crude oil basically take 3-4 weeks to come to Cyprus because of the time, the time lag. So it seems that probably in a couple of weeks we might get lower prices.
Well, I do think I read somewhere that Saudi Arabia was planning to release more oil, so that might have an impact. In the meantime, I guess we'll have to learn to either walk, catch one of those irregular buses, or just stay at home. Pleasure talking to you, Sophronis. Let's keep our fingers crossed that life doesn't get too difficult for the vulnerable groups among us. And thank you very much indeed, Sophronis Clearidis, Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Management at the University of Cyprus, for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.